how do we evaluate the resolution of uncertainty consequent upon our behavior? And by behavior here, I'm talking about from very, very simple things like where do I look next in the next 250 milliseconds as I visually palpate my world, right through to what news channels do I trust? Who do I trust? And the notion of epistemic trust here, I am reading as, well, I have now inferred that you are the kind of person that will resolve my uncertainty. And that inference is sometimes extremely difficult.
Keep watching to learn more. For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
You are warmly invited to visit transformationandintegration.com to access additional resources that support the journey through deep transformation, and to learn more about the ongoing offerings at Center for Transformation and Integration, including our certified training in transformational coaching with an emphasis in somatic integration therapy. I look forward to welcoming you there.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hi, I'm Leanne Whitney, guest host working alongside longtime host and producer Jeffrey Mishlove and our other colleagues here at New Thinking Aloud. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Karl Friston back to the show. Karl is widely regarded as one of the most influential neuroscientists of our time, with a body of work that has profoundly shaped contemporary neuroscience, neuroimaging, and theoretical models of mind and brain. Karl's research has been cited hundreds of thousands of times, over 300,000 at the time of today's recording, and he continues to influence a strikingly wide range of fields, from neuroscience and psychology to artificial intelligence and machine learning, and on and on. He is a professor at University College London and is known for developing foundational tools in neuroimaging, such as statistical parametric mapping, voxel-based morphometry, and dynamic causal modeling. His most far-reaching contribution, though, is the free energy principle, a unifying framework that describes how living systems persist by minimizing uncertainty through perception, learning, and action. In our first conversation, Karl and I explored themes including attachment, affective neuroscience, play, culture, and what it means for a system and a person to remain viable in an uncertain world. In today's conversation, we're turning our attention more explicitly to epistemic trust, the conditions under which minds remain open to learning from one another, how trust shapes our relationship to uncertainty, and what happens when that trust breaks down, individually and collectively. We talk about belonging, honoring boundaries, finding spaces and containers where we can relearn, and also how important it is to understand both from a top-down and bottom-up approach. Karl is joining me remotely from his home in the UK, and now I will switch over to the internet interview. Karl Friston, welcome back to New Thinking Aloud.
Thank you very much for having me back. It's wonderful to be here.
Wonderful. So when we met last time, epistemic trust was something we decided at the end of the interview that we hadn't truly delved deeply into or fully unpacked. And so let's pick up there and talk today about epistemic trust, because we are most certainly living in a time when people don't know who or what to trust anymore. You know, AI,
the deepfakes. So just starting right off the top in everyday language, if we can, how does the brain decide who or what to believe?
Yeah, that's a a beautiful but very vexed question, and I think it's quite foundational to the way that we make sense of our world and also the decisions and choices we make. So, from an active inference perspective, motivated behavior that has intended goals in the future, has two fundamental aspects. One is a pragmatic aspect. We try to avoid surprising, aversive kinds of outcomes, where those are literally the kind of outcomes that would be very uncharacteristic of somebody like me. But probably the more important part is this, often referred to as information gain. You can think of it as the drives for curiosity, novelty seeking, um, effectively the epistemic part of motivated behavior, that which compels us to resolve our uncertainty by seeking out the consequences of our actions that would maximally resolve or reduce our uncertainty about the world. Um, so that raises a deep question. How do we evaluate the resolution of uncertainty consequent upon our behavior? And by behavior here, I'm talking about from very, very simple things like where do I look next in the next 250 milliseconds as I visually palpate my world, right through to what news channels do I trust? Who do I trust? And the notion of epistemic trust here, I am reading as, well, I have now inferred that you are the kind of person that will resolve my uncertainty. And that inference is sometimes extremely difficult. And as you were intimating in the introduction, probably more difficult in the current age of technology and communication than it has been for centuries. The choices that we have in terms of where do we turn for valuable uncertainty resolving information are now so diverse that makes the identification of those sources of information that we trust extremely difficult. And that in itself can be anxiety producing, simply because you now don't quite know what to do next, in the sense that there are so many options that it makes it very difficult to identify one definitive those kinds of the actions that have the greatest epistemic affordance, to use sort of Gibsonian take on this.
So a couple things I'm hearing is like when you say anxiety, like the sense of overwhelm, like our nervous systems become overwhelmed. Anxiety to me is indicative of fear. Am I going to make the right choice? Not the right choice. Anxiety being like a key signal for fear, but also it can be a signal for other things like belonging. Um, well, maybe walk us through then in today's day and age of AI, deepfakes, multiple news channels. Is it the way people speak? Is it their facial expression? Is it how we gauge one nervous system to another? What is it that helps us move towards certainty or towards allowing the learning to take place?
Yeah, I think you've just answered your own question in the way that you phrased it. You use the word belonging there. You also use the word seeking. Um, so you are naturally going to um, behave and relate to other people um, that give you a sense of belonging to, say, an epistemic group. Um, so how do you infer that this group, this community, is going to provide you the kind of uncertainty resolving information that you are seeking? And of course, as you say, you will be assimilating all sorts of cues, gathering evidence for to what extent are you like me? So if I am trying to understand the world, and I want to make sense of that world on the basis of what you tell me, then it is crucial that we have a shared narrative, a shared outlook, technically a shared generative model or internal world model of the way that the world works. So if I can infer that you are like me, I will know that you have a worldview, and the things that you will know will be most easily communicated to me in such a way that it makes sense to me, and it is considered to resonate or to coheres with my worldview, and in particular, those things that I find attractive, and also those things that I find aversive. So if we have part of our shared narrative, part of our shared generative model includes those things that we find surprising, and usually mathematically surprising, emotionally anxiety-inducing, aversion, sometimes thought of in terms of negative reward or cost or punishment. So there are certain states of affairs that we will want to avoid. And if I can infer that you are the same kind of thing, the same kind of creature that shares those prior commitments and those prior preferences, that sense of belonging, then, put it another way around, if I make that inference that you are like me, then I belong to you and you belong to me. And if you generalize that notion, you have the notion now of an epistemic community, an epistemic group. And indeed, when you simulate these information-seeking agents, where they now have to choose who to listen to, you do simulate, and what emerges from these simulations are very characteristic of in-group and out-group formation, echo chambers, being one aspect of the formation of these epistemic groups. Does that make sense?
It does. The question would become, let's just say, there's so many things coming up for me, but what if one joins a group rather quickly in order to fulfill the need to belong? Are there signals or red flags along the way? And I think you're already answering to some of these, like to update the model or to continue to, I love the word discernment, filter, discern, not lock in on certainty so much that curiosity and openness and model updating no longer become possible.
I think technically, again, if one simulates this in I'd say a dyadic or two people interacting, and they are trying to converge on a shared worldview, a shared generative model, a shared narrative, what tends to happen is that one person will be drawn to the other person in proportion to the precision or credence that they afford their prior beliefs about the way that one should communicate or the way that the world works. So you get sometimes an asymmetry, which you can think of in terms of a sort of mathematically a master-slave relationship, or a student-teacher kind of relationship, or a parent-child kind of relationship. And the only thing that differentiates the pair in the dyad is that the parent or the teacher, the person that usually a younger person might endow with epistemic trust, has more precise beliefs. But if you're both in the game of trying to reach common ground, and you will be compelled to do so simply by the imperative to minimize surprise, to render the world as predictable as possible. But of course, in conversation with another, the only other part of the world is the other person you're talking to. So you're trying to minimize your surprise, render this person as predictable as possible. So the solution to that, when taken through the eyes of both people, is to have a joint attention and a joint and a shared generative model. But to get to that, we both have to learn about each other. And the rate at which we learn depends upon how stubborn we are, effectively. So you can read the precision or the credence or the reliability afforded prior beliefs about that are entailed by the generative model as a resistance to updating. So if I believe something either personally or subpersonally with a high degree of precision, it's going to take a lot of sensory evidence for me to revise those beliefs. So it can look as if I'm learning very, very slowly, very, very cautiously. On the other hand, if my prior beliefs are imprecise, and therefore I will have a sort of childlike a childlike ability to update and change my beliefs so I can explore other ideas, then it'll look as if I'm learning very, very quickly. Now, if you've got two interacting agents, one with very precise beliefs and one with very, very imprecise beliefs, what will happen is the agent with the imprecise beliefs will learn very, very quickly. But learn what? Well, it'll learn from the agent with precise beliefs. So now the student becomes drawn to the teacher. So it's an interesting question. What would happen if you join a new group? And you've got it depends very much upon the prior convictions and commitments that you bring to the table. If you go in there with very, very precise beliefs, and that group is not resonant with your particular prior beliefs, it's basically not your kind of group. And you're going to be constantly surprised by the interactions afforded by talking to people in that group. And that surprise will manifest as angst, and it'll be a part of the realization that, in fact, this is not my kind of group. But if you go in there with imprecise beliefs, with an open mind, as it were, then you will quite quickly imbue and assimilate and converge to the group consensus. So if you go, when you said what happens if I join a group too quickly, I think what you I would read that as what is the scenario in which I quickly become absorbed into and become part of a particular group. And that tells me that at the point of entry, I probably had very imprecise prior beliefs. I was searching for a resolution of the uncertainty that is associated with having imprecise beliefs. I think it's very much dependent upon how quickly you can assimilate and converge upon this particular in-group's prior convictions and worldview.
Yeah. So to back up at the point of entry, like, what is the need? And does that agent, that person, are they in touch with what they're needing when they approach the group? And does that self-knowledge play a crucial role in the next step of inference or the next step of knowledge building, right? I'm wondering if we can, even draw like a real particular example. Say a child leaves the house without having bonded with the primary caregivers. So models of safety aren't even known through their embodied brain. What is the need again? So if they're leaving one system, a family system, where the bond didn't take place, I would subscribe to the fact that we're born experience expectant of being able to bond with the primary caregivers. So if the system is derailed right in those early days, is it possible people are again, the self-knowledge might not be mature enough to hone in on the need, and then groups could be joined that are ultimately, I want to say, detrimental to well-being of that agent. Are you with me there?
No, absolutely. I think that's a great example. and we could take that so many ways. First of all, what is the primary imperative for joining a group? I think it is basically, you can summarize that in terms of self-evidencing, gathering evidence that your model of the world is the right model of the world. And of course, if you're interacting with confirmatory evidence from other things that have this, who share your world model, that's satisfying the need for evidence that my model of the world is the correct model of the world. So that's just another way of saying I'm minimizing my surprise. I am engaging in a particular niche, a particular group, a particular culture that doesn't surprise me, and in eliminating that surprise or reducing that surprise to the degree that I can, I am now effectively, mathematically, that is equivalent to gathering evidence that my model of the world is the right, apt model. It has the greatest adaptive fitness for this world because I have sought out this particular world. So, the need to belong is, I think, is foundational. So, from my point of view, without putting any teleology on it, the free energy minimizing solution, or the surprise minimizing solution for any ensemble of agents, of people, or populations, is simply when the joint surprise is minimized, the joint free energy is minimized, which just means that everybody is supplying evidence to everybody else that they've got the right model of their co-constructed world. So that's sort of the foundation. But I think what you're talking about is the next level. So it's when we're choosing what to do and who to talk to and who to approach and who to engage with, this basically depends upon planning and the goal directed and the epistemically driven kinds of behaviors that are characteristic of me. And in so doing, there's now a dialectic. There's a curiosity. There's a drive to find a niche that is where I belong. But on the other hand, I also am very curious. I need to resolve uncertainty about what it'd be like to be part of that niche. Now, let's go to that. I think excellent example of a child who has come from a very volatile, very chaotic family system, and has now learned very, very precisely that there is that the world does not actually reciprocate any evidence that you belong in a consistent way. So that child now, when going out into the world, has now got a very precise belief that there is no nurturing, there is no uncertainty resolving interaction to be had. The world is a chaotic, unpredictable place. So that is in itself a very precise prior belief. They've now built a world model prematurely that the world is a chaotic, unpredictable place, and all dyadic interactions and social interactions are going to be slightly surprising, always unpredictable. And if they believe that, they are subject to one of these very pernicious kinds of self-maintaining behaviors, in the sense that they will never afford themselves the opportunity to secure evidence that it could be another way. So it's one of those behaviors, a bit like, say, social withdrawal, where you stop yourself exposing yourself to evidence that contradicts your hypothesis that the world is an awful place to interact with. So it is a premature prior conviction, which, of course, as a therapist, it's extremely difficult to undo. And you could argue that therapy in and of itself is just an opportunity for that child to experience things that will allow them to revise their belief that the world is inconsistent and unpredictable. So, the very foundations of therapy in terms of sort of consistency and safety and predictability, irrespective of the content of the therapeutic interaction, the very existence that there exists a part of the world that you can start to revise your hypotheses that things are, your convictions that the world, everybody is unpredictable and, chaotic, that now you can start to challenge that and then slowly revise your beliefs. And as we were saying before, it will be a slow process because this poor child has now got very precise beliefs. So they're going to learn very, very slowly because they prematurely committed to this particular understanding of the social or the pro-social world. Is that what you were driving?
Yeah, I love that you brought in like the therapeutic container as a new learning environment to update these prior beliefs, safe therapeutic containers. And it's almost like safety and care, could we say, like in order to be presenced in these, again, these embodied brains, these human systems, safety and care, are they critical aspects of, foundational elements in order for us to thrive, both individually and together?
Yes, I mean, mathematically, safety is just a precise, confident belief that I'm not going to be very surprised. I'm using surprise again here in a very general technical sense. I would be surprised if I was physically damaged, if I lost a limb or had a temperature of minus, 20 degrees centigrade. Anything that sort of takes me out of my characteristic states of being is surprising. So safety just is a situation where I am confident that all my essential variables, be they emotional, physiological, or intellectual, are going to remain within those characteristic, these characteristic states. So that is, if you like, one way of expressing this imperative to avoid surprises. The ability to avoid surprises and the knowledge you can avoid surprises just will give you a sense of safety. And that is, in terms of the containment metaphor that you just used, that would be certainly one of the most important offerings of a therapeutic context and a therapeutic relationship. You also use a number of words. Caring, I think. You've talked about seeking and caring, and I'm always reminded that Pansket's sort of foundational emotions include these things. There are certain there are certain prior beliefs I think that we are either born with or are epigenetically engineered, or possibly cultural niche construction context we acquire very, very early on, that do have this foundational prior that I am a caring thing. I think care is as important as fear, to nurture. So when I decide what to do, part of deciding what to do will be acting in a way that doesn't surprise myself. And if I have the prior belief that I am a caring kind of thing, then I am going to choose those actions that provide confirmatory evidence that I am caring. So I think within us all, and there has to be, you could argue it couldn't be any other way in any society or any ecosystem that has lots of things that can interact, care for, or not with other things. But by definition, the very existence of these joint free energy minimizing solutions among multiple agents or ensemble of people or populations, it has to be the case that they all believe that they should be caring for each other. So I think care is absolutely essential here. And of course, if you're not exposed to the right kind of care, or it's a very ambivalent kind of care, is to speak to sort of attachment theory, then it's going to be very difficult for you to, in the sense of cultural inheritance or evolutionary psychology, acquire that foundational prior, which you would then need to integrate into society when you leave your immediate family. So I think care and seeking are absolutely crucial and foundational aspects of our self models that are part of our generative models. And they're exactly the kind of constructs that I was talking about when talking about the priors, the things that we bring to the table or acquire very early on that shape our behavior and shape our choices, simply to guide us to act in a way that is consistent with the kind of person that I think I am.
The mismatches between the walk and the talk, or this narrative we're living through versus maybe the knot in our stomach. Like what are the indicators that whatever we're presenced in, whether you call it a narrative or a bubble of experience, what are some signs that people can wake up to the fact that maybe could we use the word incongruence? I love interpersonal neurobiology, and in that system of thought, Dan Siegel talks about cohesive narratives and coherent narratives. And cohesion is certainly great, like all the facts will line up, but does it last over long periods of time? Does it remain coherent in multiple situations, or does it break down? So it's more like, let's just say, like an egoic kind of narrative that one made a very cohesive story, but it really breaks down over time. Do you see where I'm going there? Like, what would be red flags or signs that indicate to us that maybe we want to take a step back and look more closely at either the thinking in the embodied feelings or the walk and the talk?
So will it break down? I like this notion of sort of a coherent narrative. And of course, you can read coherent in many different ways. You could read it in the context of having a shared narrative, that my narrative, my world model is coherent with yours because we cohere, we can riff together, simply because we have this sort of common ground. And if it's the case that you are always there for me, as I say, a therapist or a mother, then I can act in a way to maintain that coherence simply by directing all my behavior towards you. So I remain in where I think I belong, because this is a source of a coherent or evidence that I am now in a coherent world, and my model coheres with with that world, which of course, in terms of a dyadic interaction, would be largely you. So what would happen, and I think this is what you're driving at, what would happen if things change, if I leave the family, for example, or perhaps towards the end of therapy, I start to anticipate that you're not going to be there as my therapist anymore. So in this instance, your model may well have to change because the world you are modeling is changing. And of course, what I'm talking about here is, in one sense, I know that I'm going to have to undergo some kind of grief reaction. So I often think of grief reactions as basically just the model updating, the new learning that is required to now adapt to the new situation. So what are the warning signs that would portend that? And I know the answer you want, and I think you're absolutely right. And it sort of ties in the body and the interoceptive inference with, as really important sources of evidence. So if I have an impending sense that things aren't quite coherent in the way that they used to be, this will be mathematically registered in terms of surprising outcomes, implausible, unpredicted outcomes. So, when we were talking about the predictive processing or predictive coding formulation of this, lots of unattenuated prediction errors that I can't resolve through my behavior. But crucially, all those prediction errors, all those signals of surprise come in many, many different modalities. So those would be we can usually divide these modalities into exteroceptive, the things that I see and I hear from extrapersonal space. So this would include, for example, you mentioned facial expressions before. So if we are coherent in our conversation and we've mathematically acquired a certain kind of generalized synchrony, that will also be expressed in the way that you move your face and your expressions and our joint, our eye gazes, and the way that we dance and communicate non-verbally, and that a lot of the visual modality will carry a lot of that information. It's all evidence that everything's coherent, everything's going well. The auditory modality, of course, is responsible for registering the communication. Somatosensory would be affiliated touch in a sort of developmental context. But there are other really important modalities. They come in two more flavors, proprioceptive and interoceptive. So proprioceptive just tells you the state of your body at the moment. It's the kind of signals that tell you the position of your limbs, usually the parts of your body that you have volitional control over. So if you've got a surprising feeling from there, that would be quite unnerving. It might be, suddenly you're paralyzed. So you had a stroke, or so less catastrophically, you've got a sleepy leg because you've been sitting in an improper way. So this would be surprising, and it would, to a certain extent, depend upon proprioceptive input. But I think probably the much more important, which is what you're driving at, are the interoceptive, the embodied signals, literally the gut feelings. Well, the feeling would be a construct we use to interpret the interoceptive signals, but the interoceptive signals. So what this means is that you can regard your body as one of the most important sensory organs. So if things aren't quite going as anticipated at every level, personal in terms of proposition, in terms of narratives, in terms of the things that we can articulate at a sort of personal or conscious level, right the way through down to the kind of things that govern our autonomic reflexes, our physiology. If things aren't going according to plan, there will be surprise signals from your body. And those are really informative in terms of what you should do next and the emotional state of mind that you should put yourself in or recognize you are in. And of course, once you get this sort of notion that everything is an act of inference, everything that you do depends upon the context and the state of affairs that you infer, and that inference has to be on the basis of evidence. And if the body is an important source of evidence, then it's going to have a profound effect on the emotional status and your intentional set or intentional stance and your attentional set that constitutes your emotional state of mind at the moment. And if I recognize that I am in a particular emotional state of mind at the moment, then I can make appropriate adjustments to my body. So, I think we've spoken before about, sort of anxiety. Where does anxiety come from? Well, it probably comes from a dialogue with the body, in a very simple sense, that if I sense that my heart is racing, I may not be able to consciously sense it, but some part of my brain will sense that my heart is racing via my autonomic nervous system. Then that supplies evidence. Well, perhaps I am anxious. And if I am anxious, I have learned that in situations of anxiety, it's best to freeze or flight or to do something that is likely to require muscular energy expenditure, which will therefore incur cardiac acceleration. So, you've now got a sort of either virtuous or vicious cycle, very much a sort of James Langian kind of, say, demarcio-somatic marker hypothesis, which is self-maintaining. It's all part of this sort of inferential dialogue with your own body. Because you have control over your body, you can act upon your body, but your body is also your sensory organ. that's telling you, no, things aren't going quite as they should do. So, what red flags you'd be looking for? You'd be looking for all red flags, and they would simply be those things you didn't predict. But crucially, they can come along in very different flavors, and it's important not to ignore the interoceptive red flags.
So important. I love what you're sharing there. So bottom up, top down. So the cortex, the story, maybe the left hemisphere sends signals, right? The pathways are bi-directional. So if one has a story that one is unworthy or unlovable, and one walks into a new group, is trying a new group, that whether it's conscious or unconscious thought pattern could be kicking up different signals in the body. And also, if one is open and walks into a room, it's more of like a bottom up, so to speak. Like the gut, the nervous system, the brainstem are picking up maybe signals of non-safety in the room. So we also need to discern or learn the bi-directional pathways as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that bottom up, top down thing is, that's the basic mechanics or calculus of inference. That there's bottom up evidence, usually of a sensory sort, and then there's top down predictions that are required to actually to move, to act, to autonomically change the state of being. So when you sort of think about the importance of this sort of bi-directional traffic, the bottom up and the top down, that's just one, I think, really useful way of thinking about this sort of circular causality, which generically could be cast in terms of perception action cycle, but you can also think of it in terms of ascending prediction errors and descending predictions, where crucially the predictions cause something to change. So I think that's a really fundamental sort of architecture of sense making, the way that our brains work. But coming back to your example of going into a room or entering a new group with certain predictions of a top down sort, if just to pick up on an early example that you gave us, about somebody who has always experienced social interactions as evidence that effectively they are unlovable, they are unlikable, or if they are likable, it will come with a degree of ambivalence and some possibly surprising outcome after a period of time. Now, if you believe that, then you believe that's the kind of person you are. If you are seeking evidence for the fact that you are this kind of person, you are going to preferentially join, or you will only remain a member of a group that provides evidence that you are unlovable. So, somewhat perversely, because you are now in charge of the evidence that you gather through your actions, both on the inside and physically using our volitional muscles, you will seek out situations that confirms and verifies and validates and confirms your beliefs about the kind of thing that you are. So it would not surprise me to find somebody who had a very chaotic upbringing and had the prior belief that they were not lovable would find themselves in a culture, in a group, where this was confirmed by every member of that group. And it would be a very unloving group, because it's all providing evidence that they're all right about their world. And this, of course, from the point of view of that group, is perfectly Bayes optimal. This is exactly what they're seeking. But it doesn't have to be that, but they will never find out, because they've committed with too much precision to that kind of group. In that kind of group, they will be soliciting all the signals that confirm the world is unpredictable, including those interoceptive signals. They may go off and engage in activities that somebody like me would find quite aversive, being sort of highly stressed or put myself in a sort of a physical confrontatory situation. But for them, that would be evidence that yes, they are always on the move. They are always in either a defensive or a offensive state of mind, because that's the kind of thing that they believe they are.
Yeah, that it's like the loop, right? It can be really challenging to get out of these loops or out of
Yeah.
these narratives, out of these identities. You brought up the auditory elements. I want to see if we can hone in on that a little bit. Like people who speak with so much conviction, but they're speaking mm, maybe less fact and more opinion, we could say, or even a right out a false story. Um, but yet they find people to trust them. Whether it's a parent with children in the household, a parent who needs control, maybe has lack of safety in their own system and hasn't done any kind of deep dive to understand their system. Maybe it's a cult leader, or I don't know if this would be an appropriate way to segue into conspiracy theories, but that auditory element of like really strong conviction, do our apparatuses tend to want to, whether we say fall for or believe uh, the conviction?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we portray ourselves, especially in this world of social media and the availability of news on iPhones, and, the exteroceptive cues that we offer people to invite epistemic trust become extremely important. The way that we look and the way that we talk, and of course, if I want to influence you, then whether I know it or not, will have to provide those kinds of cues that represent a conviction and a precision in my beliefs. And certainly that will attract those people who are looking for their prior beliefs to be their precision to be increased, so they can feel more certain and more precise and more confident by learning from somebody who has this ability to induce this kind of epistemic trust. There is no truth pointing here. There is no truth out there. You will seek out the truth that is simply the evidence for you, for your beliefs and your model as you're building your model. So you don't have to tell the truth, but as long as you tell it with conviction, in a way that cues and invites epistemic trust, then that certainly will be extremely effective. Of course, you have to maintain that untruth in a coherent fashion. But of course, if you've just got your cult around you, then there is, for free, a self-made self-assembling kind of epistemic trust, which is again the mutual provision of evidence that this is how the world works. This is how we interact. This is the right way to view things.
And again, maybe even contrary to evidence sometimes, right? People who have really locked into, again, belonging and let's just say a cult or inside a conspiracy theory, that no matter what story is told, they keep sort of connecting the dots and linking one thing after another thing after another thing, and keep making that cohesive story. Are there foundational energies, offerings that we could be doing either in ourselves, between, that could help solve some of the distrust or discord today?
So yeah, I'm sure you got better answers than I have, given the people that you talk to. But if I were to answer that question from a purely academic point of view, I think what you're talking about is sustainability and resilience. So is there a secret source that underwrites something that is both resilient and sustainable at every level? And the answer is yes. The whole point of active inference, the free energy principle, and surprise minimization, it is just a description of things that endure in a sustainable way. So mathematically, that keep themselves within unsurprising characteristic states, mathematically known as an attracting set. So if you comply with this surprise minimizing principle, then yes, you by definition will be acting in a way that is sustainable and enduring and will be resilient to change. You're not going to find yourself off or out of your attracting set. I think the more taxing questions now, well, what happens when you have lots of things that constitute a niche? So what is a sustainable niche? The reason it's a so more taxing or more vexed question is it depends upon the scale of the niche that you're talking about. So if we imagine a group that is closed in the sense that it is not exposed to the rest of the universe. In physics, this will be a closed system. And in a closed system, the system will attain an equilibrium. So in physics, this will be a free energy minimum. And it's the kind of physics you learnt at school. And from a sort of informational point of view, that free energy minimum is a surprise minimizing thing. So everybody's confirming themselves. They're elaborating. Let's take conspiracy theories, for example. Let's say that there is no outside influence and you can now treat all the participants in a social group as immune from or sequestered from the rest of the world. Then they will ultimately find the simplest explanation that they all can commit to, that can be quite elaborate because if everything is explained by everything else, that provides a very simple and efficient explanation which resolves surprise, and they found their equilibrium. But that's not, of course, how the universe works. The universe has a scale invariance, which means there are multiple scales nested within each other. So by definition, every group is open. So now we're talking about the physics of open systems and non-equilibrium, far from equilibrium physics. But the free energy minimization still occurs. It just now creates a particular tension between aspiring to an equilibrium within your local community, whilst at the same time, the same process being enacted at a broader scale with communities of communities. And that now basically begs the question, to what extent, what are the principles that underlie sustainable scale-free dynamics? And the answer to that is that you rehearse the same principles at each scale. You have to you have to be able to separate the scales. So in broad brush of sort of vernacular terms, what that basically means is there has to be clear boundaries at every scale. And the notion of a boundary here, I think, is quite important. Both boundary in the sense that you and I would talk about in an analytic context, and also in sort of vernacular conversation, but also that a physicist or mathematician would talk about. So in my world, that would be a Markov boundary or a Markov blanket. But if we just use the sort of common sense notion of a boundary, what we're talking about is that this scale-free sustainability that precludes surprising events like catastrophes and wars and the like, rests upon a careful set of nested boundaries that have this scale invariant aspect, which means that you have to have a big boundary that allows for heterogeneity within it with lots of little boundaries, and so on all the way down. So now there has to be a balance between the in-group, the conspiracy theorists that I listen to, but I also have to be part of a larger group that would not subscribe to this. So there's this tension between committing and seeking evidence within my group and this natural curiosity, information seeking beyond my group. And that dialectic is very much related to where we started in terms of the two imperatives for intentional behavior or choice behavior. We've got the pragmatic surprise minimizing. I'll find all the evidence I need just by chatting to my conspiracy friends online, versus the epistemic seeking part of the imperatives for behavior, the novelty seeking, the curiosity. The reason that we are talking now and the reason that people will listen to us talk now is because they're curious, they're information seeking, because hopefully they will imbue us with some epistemic trust. So that's the other side of it, but you have to go outside your group in order to get that. You have to go to your teacher, your trusted source of information. So it's now a balance between this tendency, this pragmatic drive for a feeling of belonging and seeking evidence that is uncertainty resolving simply because everything is predictable, versus the other side of uncertainty reduction, which is seeking information in places you haven't been before, sometimes sort of in terms of the explore, exploit dilemma, which is dissolved if you subscribe to this overall imperative to minimize expected surprise or expected free energy. The final point, which I think is worth making here, notice that all this rests upon well-defined and maintained boundaries. And that basically means you've got to be very careful about dissolving boundaries. So how would you dissolve a boundary? And if you did, what would it look like? Well, it would look like basically you're turning your society into a soup. It would be literally chaotic. And it would dissolve. It would dissipate. It would no longer have any structure. It wouldn't be literally a thing anymore. So this is if you like, the opposite of sustainability, is what we all try to avoid at each and every scale. So what maintains our boundaries, or what could be a threat to our boundaries? It's basically connectivity. So we arrive at a rather paradoxical situation or conclusion that the secret source of sustainability is to avoid overconnectivity. That will destroy the boundaries. So we come back to what we were talking about before. There are too many choices with who I connect. And the nature of that connection destroys the boundaries. So, if you want to be sustainable, you have to look at the model that it has been sustained, which is a well-defined, scale-free, nested structure of connectivity that starts with the caregiver-child relationship, extends to the family, extends to the extended family, extends to the social group, the village, and the village within a county, and the county within a state, and the state within a nation, the nation. But at every level, there has to be very constrained connectivity, so very well maintained and structured exchange across these boundaries.
Well, that again, it goes back to, for me anyway, the ideas of stability, instability, or destabilizing. It's so important, either in our communities or with the leaders that we choose, that the world views, if we want to stay alive, are ones of maintaining stability amongst us as a collective just species-wide, right? But as you're pointing out, it's like, these nested hierarchies or turtles all the way down, or just these, there's lots of groups, micro, macro, and at certain levels, things can be very destabilizing depending upon what that narrative is or what those set of shared beliefs are. Like, we all die if too many nuclear weapons are all of a sudden going to be deployed on the planet.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, because I think it's a really important point. And just to celebrate your use of the word stability. So when I talk about open systems through the lens of physics as engaged in non-equilibrium steady state, that just is one way of describing the stability and the sustainability that you're talking about. Interestingly, the same kind of notion arises in evolutionary thinking when you're talking about evolutionary steady states or stable states. And you can apply that kind of thinking to epistemic exchanges and group formation. And it's interesting that um, to think about the different evolutionary steady states or stable states solutions that are sustainable. You talked about we don't want to die. I'm not sure about that. I think we are we have a prior belief that we're not the kind of things that do die quickly. And we sort of act in a way to avoid surprising, like sort of killing ourselves. Not always, though, but generally speaking. Um, uh, but I think the sort of the deeper thing is that we crave predictability and sustainability. And of course, if we live forever, then that's one kind of predictability and sustainability, but it's not necessarily the only kind in terms of sort of generational turnover in an evolutionary setting. So I just wanted to sort of pick up on that notion of stability and sustainability, which is mathematically right at the heart of self-organization of the scale-free sort. And what you were talking about, in terms of geopolitical calamities and war and the like, that these boundaries have to be maintained at all scales, because the boundaries within one mega boundary depend upon the mega boundary to contextualize interactions within, and again all the way down. So you can't fiddle, you can't break with the boundaries at any scale, otherwise the whole thing collapses. So that's why people are so anxious, I think, again, in a very sort of simplistic way, so anxious about Putin trying to change the boundaries, geopolitical boundaries. This can have a profoundly destabilizing effect. So irrespective of your politics, mathematically, this is one way in which you can destroy a system by changing the boundary at one scale, and that will have implications for all the scales, all the way down to family relationships with somebody in, say, Kiev. So boundaries can manifest at many different scales, and we all have to be mindful that if you want that stability, then you have to maintain the boundaries that demarcate this kind of thing from that kind of thing, or this culture from that culture, and carefully maintain it and treasure it. Because if they go away, the structure dissipates. And if the structure dissipates, we all die, as you say.
Yes, yes. Again, to reference back to interpersonal neurobiology, and we in yoga psychology as well. I mention it a lot on this show, but it's like differentiation and linkage. Like we want the connectivity, but we must maintain those boundaries so we have those differentiated pieces, right? We want a fruit salad and not a frap is basically what it comes down to. Like we want to be able to see those boundaries and see the different elements, and they're, could we say, important, like if we just in terms of health and medicine, like to know what magnesium does or potassium does, like we want to isolate and know what the parts are doing, and we don't want it all to be blended together, but we do want the connectivity. So it's a both and. It's like the differentiation and the linkage.
Yes, and you could even take that. I don't know whether you want to talk about meditation and yoga and the like, but in a sense, that's also developing skills that allow you to access control over your connectivity with the sensorium, with the connectivity with the world through your sense organs and through your body. So, at every level, I think that's a really important observation.
I would love to talk about yoga for a minute here for a couple reasons. You brought up you said truth, like in when we were talking about conspiracy theories, that it doesn't necessarily have to be true. Now, in Patanjali's yoga psychology, the first limb of that um, practice and philosophy they're called the yamas, and the first two aspects of that are nonviolence and trust. Or truth, I'm sorry, nonviolence and truth are components in order for that yoking, and again, pure consciousness basically in matter. So our apparatus is all within the category of prakriti in that system of thought, all phenomena. whether it's just like an emotion we feel or anything that we can physically sense or see, or again, anything phenomenologically. But to make that bond between our sensorium, our being, with in that system of thought, pure consciousness, truth and nonviolence are key components in order to, I believe, work at all the scales that we're talking about. So it's therefore I can stabilize my own system, and then I can stabilize my system in this world that can often be very chaotic, very uncertain. And at when we talked to the last time, you said a beautiful statement. You said being, because again, pure consciousness and being can be synonymous in that system of thought. Being is then just the mitigation of suffering and the resolution of uncertainty. So now, through the yoga lens, if truth is not a component of one's narrative or how one is continuing to try to maybe update their model, then already from the deepest seat, if you will, to take a comfortable seat in this universe, in this phenomenological realm, one would not ultimately be able to make that yoke, harness that union, if truth were not being honored. Does that ring in any way through your system of thought or what you know of the contemplative traditions?
I don't know very much about it. I have co-authored and read a lot about it from an academic perspective, and it's a fascinating area. But it certainly resonates, on two levels. Just take the violence, the non-violence part. I mean, what is violence mathematically? How would you describe an act of violence if you had to describe to a physicist or indeed even a theoretical biologist? I think what you're talking about is effectively what we were just talking about, which is the breach of boundaries and breach of of the Markov blanket that I mentioned previously. But and I'm talking about a breach of boundaries in many senses. So just think about the violence that I can do to someone with a gun or with a knife. I literally penetrate the boundary that defines their body. The violence I can do if I blow somebody up is to destroy the distinction between their body and the rest of their immediate environment. So from a physics point of view, violence just is the loss of that carefully co-constructed set of boundaries that define things at multiple scales. And some of those things, of course, are you and me. Other things are cultures, other things are nations, and so on, right up to the biosphere. So I think the non-violence imperative is exactly consonant with the definition of existence defined in terms of those things that can sustain themselves in characteristic states that are discernible from the states of something else. And the way that you discern that the state is characteristic and it is occupied over time, as opposed to the state of something else, is because of the existence of the boundary. So that's exactly consistent with a sort of the physics of self-organization in the scale-free context. The truth is interesting. So when I was talking about truth before, I was assuming we were talking about sort of the truth decay from Obama that we could argue we hear a lot about now in terms of populist politicians. However, I think what you're talking about is really that sense of centering and truth, which is our shared truth, and that speaks to the unity part of things. So in my world, there is no, if you like, metaphysical truth out there, but there certainly is a veridical explanation. There is a unique explanation for what I see and what I sample that could be out there, may or may not metaphysically exist. And that unique one is basically the best explanation. And the best explanation, sometimes in philosophy or in statistics, this would be inference to the best explanation. So there is a unique best explanation for me. And my lived world, or at least my sensed world, and I would say that is the truth for me. And mathematically, that would also be coincident with the free energy minima or the surprise minima, the best explanation for all the sensory evidence that my sensory organs affords me. So in that, if you allow me to read truth as best explanation, then yeah, it's mathematically identical to active inference.
Yes, yes. It is truth, and again, at multiple scales in that system of thought, like the honesty within, like the non-greed, non-stealing. It's really important to stabilize in order to take a comfortable seat in the body and be able to engage the world with an open heart, stay curious and open and playful. Without closing down, right? So we want, and that's what the yoga asanas are basically just a metaphor for the psychology. We want the strength of the postures, but also the flow. We want to be able to flow and stay in a nice flow of integration without, closing down too much or right being wide open. So we neither want to be closed down on an identity that doesn't allow us to stay in flow and stay curious and open. But then we also don't want to be blown wide open where we're just believing everything that comes in front of us either.
Yeah.
It's
Well, it's exactly the same dialectic we were talking about before between sort of seeking that sense of belonging, yet you're also indulging in that curiosity with the explore-exploit dilemma. That is, the key challenge to the right kind of self-evidencing. Yeah, absolutely.
And why I love your system of thought is because it's so applicable across so many disciplines. We would have to go deeper to see where yoga would eventually disagree. But one way I suppose I could invite you into that question is there a time when it's no longer about better inference, but it's about something else entirely? In other words, does less inference come into play at any point in your system of thought? Or is it always sort of honing better inference?
That's an interesting question. So technically the answer is no, it's not always about inference. And, one simple example of that is one could argue the ultimate meditative state, which is to be asleep. So, we don't go around harvesting information, being curious all the time and avoiding surprises. We spend quite a lot of our life asleep. Or in contemplative practice, many people sort of do spend quite a lot of their time or chunks of their day, at least, in these sort of contemplative states of mind, which are not information seeking. You're not rushing around going to university or sort of scouring social media or the like. So what's all that about? The answer in my world would be again a nod to this scale-free or scale-invariant aspect. It is not sufficient in the moment just to gather evidence for your current beliefs about the way the world is working and your place within that world. You also have to maximize the goodness, the truthiness of your model, both in terms of its parameterization, the connectivity, the brain connectivity, the parameters of a generative model, in a sort of more mathematical sense, and also its very structure, the very architectures that contain the particular contingencies and beliefs and associations that we install through learning that themselves contextualize the very fast belief updating. So if you, and you could actually even argue that there's actually a level above that, which would be an evolutionary level. So it's not just you and me, it's actually our species. So there's a sort of a learning that is implicit from generation to generation as well, all part of this sustainable steady state or stable state that evolution sort of manifests or evinces. So if you wanted to simulate this kind of thing, then you would basically, and understand the imperatives for it, you put it at the level of structure learning. So sleep is thought to be, again, this is a purely mathematical way of thinking about it, but it's basically the ability to stand back from the sensorium, stand back from all the flood of information that you've accumulated during the day. And that flood of information has now rendered your internal world model, your generative model, too expressive, too many parameters, too many things, such that it's starting to overfit the data. It's starting to sort of draw conclusions that are not warranted, would not be, if you like, viable, fit for purpose tomorrow or indeed yesterday. So how do you deal with that? Well, to maximize the evidence, and I'll use the word truthiness again, of your model, you have to minimize the complexity. So in physics, this would be akin to things like the maximum entropy principle. You might know it as Occam's principle, for example, but it's a really important part of the evidence in self-evidencing the negative surprise. So then the minus the surprise is is effectively the evidence we're talking about. So there's this pressure to find simple explanations. You were talking before about conspiracy theories joining the dots. So basically, one story tells everything. That's a good explanation. And of course, to get at that, you've basically got to take yourself offline and discard all those spurious associations to resolve the complexity of your current understanding of the world, so that tomorrow when you wake up, you now don't overfit the data. You're starting off with a clean slate, effectively. So, if you think about contemplative practices, just think about what it is to contemplate. It's not so much contemplating what you're seeing, it's contemplating what you have seen by looking inside. And that, to my mind, means that this is an essential part of self-evidencing, but it's not about in the moment. It's really just having a look at what you have assimilated and accumulated. Is that fit for purpose? Do you need all of that stuff? Or is there some simpler and possibly even non-dual state of mind that allows you just to simplify things again? And there are mathematical ways of reading this. There are also physiological ways of reading this. I'm thinking here of Giulio Tononi and Chiara's synaptic hypothesis and synaptic homeostasis hypothesis, that we accumulate synaptic brain connections during the day, and then in contemplative practice, meditative practice, and in sleep, we sort of remove the redundant ones. We have a house clearing operation to get back to that sort of bare bones, simple explanation for the world. As Einstein said, keep everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that, to me, is the truth. So, but I say there's no real truth pointing, or there is no truth. What I meant is there is always a best explanation that is as simple as possible. I think sometimes that simplicity can involve even dissolving the notion of self. And of course, then we're talking about sort of ultimate meditative experiences with a minimal phenomenal content or a sort of non-dual aspect. There's no difference between me. There is no me. It's just a whole wonderful world. That would be the ultimate sort of simple explanation for for the lived world.
Sure, if one can then also act on the world and maintain the boundaries, that's where it sort of, again, it's going in directions too, right? So as long as one has that moment, that experience of non-duality, and then once one goes back out into one's group, as long as one's not boundary breaking and maintaining I super.
If I can, I just can't resist saying that that's a really astute observation. And indeed, it underlies the rather vexed question: if being asleep exposes me to predators that could literally break my boundary by eating me, why is sleep subject to such evolutionary pressure? If it's so dangerous not to be aware of predators, for example, why on earth have we evolved to sleep so much? I think the answer is precisely, what we've been discussing in discovering that truth, that simplicity. Just we need to do that, otherwise, indeed, experiments in small animals demonstrate that you will literally die and dissipate, after a period of sleep deprivation. So, if you equate the same kind of imperatives that underwrite the selective pressure for sleep as driving the importance of meditative practices, you could argue it is essential to contemplate, to introspect, to have these internal attention states from time to time. But also, of course, you have to engage with the world after that period of structure learning, model optimization, mathematically based model selection.
Yes. Well, as a long-term meditator, I certainly would agree with that. It's certainly been an important part of my life. But I also hear you honing in on, I hope I get this right. Einstein once said, if you can't explain it simply enough, then you don't understand it well enough, or something to that degree. So I love that you're honing in on simplicity. And would you say, in the arc of your work, or, I mean, again, you're so prolific and you have colleagues across so many different disciplines, would you say simplicity is something that you experience at the intersection of many disciplines, or do you feel like that's still in the process of all the dialogues that you're having between different disciplines?
Well, I think it's probably more foundational and established, and certainly is a common thread in my work, but I think you'll find it nearly everywhere. You know, so in, for example, machine learning, or indeed even right back to the beginning of the electronic age in terms of being able to communicate electronically, you find a really important link between the degree to which I can compress information in order to communicate it and the implicit simplification implicit in that compression. So to again use Einstein's notion, keep everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. That sort of tells you that there's an optimum degree of compression, throwing away redundant information to simplify your message or your understanding or your model or your representation, however you want to think about it. And that's the most truthful version. So you got simplicity, maximize simplicity, minimize complexity, maximize marginal likelihood or model evidence, maximally compress, which also translates into maximizing the mutual information between me and the world, or me and you if we're in communication. Just to sort of, for those people who like maths, the log of the evidence for any model of any, say, sensory data is equal to the accuracy minus the complexity. So to be a good self-evidencer, to be a good contemplator of oneself, simply is to find a model of your world that is as accurate as possible in terms of explaining everything that you see on average, but at the same time is minimally complex. So it's a really foundational aspect of, again, cheekily, I'm going to say, the only truth. The only truth is the simplest explanation that affords an accurate account of everything that you encounter.
Wonderful, sending out the top tips. I so appreciate your time and your sharing of all your wisdom. And thank you for coming back and sharing more with us at New Thinking
Great
Aloud.
pleasure. Thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you again. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for those of you watching and listening, thank you for being with us. You're the reason that we're here in community, exploring our common unity.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.